invite your attention, if you have your scriptures, to the book of Esther, the Old Testament book of Esther. It's good to see all of you. And if you don't know where it is, that's why they put a table of contents in the Bible. Amen. It's there to be used. Amen. The book of Esther, chapter 7. I want to read in your hearing verses 9 and 10. And I want to read it out of the Message translation of the Bible. And this is what the word says. Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, spoke up. Look over there. There's the gallows that Haman had built for Mordecai, who saved the king's life. It's right next to Haman's house, 75 feet high. The king said, hang him on it. So Haman was hanged on the very gallows that he had built for Mordecai. And the king's hot anger cooled. And all the people said amen. I want to tag this text with the title, The Hate You Give. You may be seated. This phrase was originally made popular in the 1990s by the late Tupac Shakur as an acronym for his album, Thug Life. His album, of course, inspired the debut novel of Angie Thomas, whose book connected successfully with a new generation grappling with gun violence and police brutality, and remained on the New York Times bestsellers list for more than a year. Both the book and the movie follow the character Star Carter, a black teenager well-versed in code switching between her black community in Garden Heights and the prep school her parents sent her to in the ostentatiously white and wealthy Williamson neighborhood. When the audience first meets her, her stern-voiced dad is having, quote-unquote, the talk that tragically every black parent has to have with their children. The talk about how to avoid being shot and killed if you are pulled over in a car by police. She, like many listening to me now, was instructed, put your hands on the dashboard, do what they say, and make no sudden moves, because it can literally be the difference between life and death. Star Carter in the movie is a vibrant 16-year-old who plays on her school's basketball team and finds love in a goofy yet earnest and charming white classmate named Chris. But the unintended consequence of having one foot in two different social circles is that you never really feel balance in either. She feels out of place both at her white prep school, where white kids love to use black slang, and out of place at a neighborhood party that she attended to try to back up her friend in a fight. However, her awkward feelings are swept aside momentarily when an old childhood crush, Khalil, approaches her with a smile decorated by some devious dimples. A fight breaks out at the party, interrupting their meeting. The two drive off in Khalil's car. On their way back to Star's home, they reminisce about the old times and even share a kiss, until the red and blue lights flash behind them in the car. A cop pulls them over for a reason never given, and Khalil gets defensive. Star tries to coach him through her father's previous warnings. Hands on the dashboard, do what they say, make no sudden moves. But when the cop walks away to run Khalil's license, he reaches for his hairbrush and shots ring out, killing him. The officer who shot first without asking questions handcuffs Star next to her dying friend, having mistaken his hairbrush for a weapon. The event is a seismic one for the community and for Star, who found herself swept up in the media frenzy and outrage. She suffered from post-traumatic stress as she struggled with the implicit bias, prejudice, injustice, and inequality with which she must live. In learning the ways of this unjust system, she decides not to accept things the way they are and not to permit the status quo to go unchallenged and unchecked this time around. And believe it or not, my friends, this is a choice we all must make. How to respond to the bias, prejudice, injustice, inequality, and hatred that we sometimes see in our world. We have to decide to speak or be silent, to act or accept, to protest or to pacify, to resist or to remain. These are the same choices confronting the characters in the text that we are teaching today. Because here in these sentences of Scripture, a man named Mordecai challenges his cousin to step up and speak up on behalf of her people who were under attack. Let me give you the context because it'll help you to appreciate the content. It's a rather incredible story because although the name of God is never mentioned in the entire book of Esther, the fingerprints of God are everywhere evident. The story opens with Mordecai. We do not know what he does for a living, and yet we can surmise quickly that he was a big baller and somewhat of a shot caller because we find him at the city gates where all the important decision makers lingered to make decisions. We are told that he is Jewish, he is part of the Commonwealth of Israel, and he adopts his cousin after her parents die. Her given name is Hadassah. Everybody say Hadassah. But she is also called, and the book is so named, Esther. Hadassah, the book says, was gorgeous, fine in face and in form, an amazing mass of protruding pulchritude. She was so stunning and beautiful. Look that up when you get home. She was so stunning and beautiful that out of thousands of women paraded before King Xerxes, the ruler of the Persian Empire, she caught his eye. Xerxes was large and in charge. He was king over 127 different provinces stretching from India all the way to Ethiopia. How many of you have ever heard the phrase, the law of the Medes and the Persians? If you've ever heard that, it references a law that is unchangeable and immutable. That idea came from the era of King Xerxes. He was viewed not just as a king, but also as a god. Whenever he spoke, it was law, and not even he could change what he had previously spoken. So you have Xerxes, and his wife was Queen Vashti. Now, Queen Vashti only appears in scene one of the story because she is spirited and spunky. She is bold and brave. She is intelligent and intuitive. She is proper, principled, and praiseworthy. She had her own mind and she made her own decisions. Like Maxine Waters, who at 80 years old, after more than 40 years of public service, has become the unlikely, unchallenged new face and voice of the poor, the urban, the least, the lost, the last, the looked over, and the left out. Vashti had her own mind. Xerxes loved a party, and he hosted one, a party that lasted 180 days. He invited all the important people in his world to come to the capital city of Susa for this party. 6 months of food and festivity, 6 months of whiskey and wine, 6 months intoxicated and inebriated. And at the end of that party, he decided to have a 7-day after party to shut it down. And in the middle of the 7-day after party, he decided that he would like for Queen Vashti to come and twirl with her crown on, to walk the runway on display for all of his friends in her crown, nothing but her crown. But because she had her own mind and made her own decisions, she refused to be disrespected and declined the invitation. I should remind somebody at this intersection that nobody can ever ride your back unless you bend over and give it to them. You can almost hear her reasoning laced in the lines of the text. In the Lance Watson translation, she says, "You've been drunk for 180 days, and now you on a 7-day binge? Boy, bye." Her decision set badly with King Xerxes and his cronies, and under pressure to try to save face, he determined to remove and replace her from her role. And Hadassah, aka Esther, was selected out of a lineup of hundreds of hopefuls. Scene 1, we lost the queen. Scene 2, a new queen is selected. Scene 3, a plot is discovered. Mordecai at the city gates overhears 2 men plotting to overthrow the king, and he leaks the information to his cousin, the new queen. Esther testifies in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee. She tells the right people. The plan is thwarted. And note what the writer inserts in chapter 2 at the end of verse 23. He says, all of this was written down in the daily court record in the king's presence. Written down like James Comey's meeting notes. The fact that Mordecai overheard the plot, told the right people, and the king's life was saved, was written down in the court record. Now that's very important, and here's why. Because in scene 4, we meet Haman. And Haman is an ambitious narcissist with an ego the size of Persia. We do not know how he came to be second in command over Persia, but we do know that once he got there, he used it to the hilt. I should just add that everybody appointed to a high government position shouldn't be there. I'm just saying, amen. He demanded that every person who saw him bow in his presence, and everyone conceded with one exception, Mordecai. Mordecai was not mortified nor intimidated by Haman, and consequently, when Haman passed by, Mordecai would be the only one out of a long row of people who was still standing erect. He had but one God before whom he would bow, and it was not Haman, it was Jehovah. Haman was enraged, and if that's not enough, the book tells us that he wants to destroy Mordecai, but also determines he's going to exterminate everybody connected to Mordecai. Scene 5, Haman convinces Xerxes that it's necessary to kill all the Jews. And with that insane executive order, the people of Susa are thrown into pandemonium. When Mordecai hears it, he weeps and fasts. He sits at the king's gate in sackcloth and ashes. Esther hears about it, but she is living like Star Carter in the movie, between two worlds, a Hebrew by day and a Persian by night. Grappling with her options in this crisis, she responds to Mordecai by brushing him off. She says, in essence, Mordecai, you don't understand how things work up here in the palace. Me and the king haven't even hooked up in 30 days. I can't just break up in his presence. You asking me to risk my future and my well-being for yours, but I don't live with y'all no more. So Mordecai sends her this message. He said, don't think that just because you live in the king's house that you are the one Jew who will get out of this alive. If you persist in staying silent in a time like this, help and deliverance for the Jewish people will arrive from someplace else. But you and your family will be wiped out. Who knows? Perhaps you have been raised up in the kingdom for such a time as this. She is confronted with the greatest decision of her life. She must go before the king uninvited, which carries the price tag of death if the king finds himself displeased. Esther 5 records the epic scene where uninvited and under the penalty of death, Esther enters the throne room. The king heard her request and then proceeded to hand her a blank check, which she could fill out however she wished. She proceeded to request the king's presence at a banquet she would prepare. The king consented and also ordered Haman to attend. Haman was overjoyed, but still murderous in his hatred towards Mordecai because he refused to bow. But at the advice of his wife, who had ice-cold water running in her veins, Haman ordered gallows to be built with the intention of hanging Mordecai on them before the week concluded. And as we arrive at the edge of Esther chapter 6, we're reminded of 4 basic principles I want to share with you quickly. And it is this, that number 1, when all seems lost, it isn't. When no one seems to notice, they do. When God seems absent, he's not. And what goes around comes around. And that's why you have to be careful about the hate you give, because whatever you give out will find its way back to you. Paul, that gospel globetrotter, would later write, be not deceived, God will not be mocked. Whatsoever a person sows, that shall they also reap. That's another way of saying don't plant what you don't want to produce. Don't give out what you don't want to get back, because God is at work. It may appear that truth forever is on the scaffold and wrong is forever on the throne, yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown stands God in the shadows. keeping watch above his own. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was right when he said the arc of the universe is long, but it's bent towards justice. Because although God is unseen, God is not unaware of what's going down and what's taking place. Because watch what happens here. The text is amazing, because first I want you to notice here the man God corners. King Xerxes was one of the most powerful men in the then known world, but there was a king who outranked him. Xerxes, aka Ahasuerus, may have ruled on earth, but the God of Esther, the God of Hadassah, the God of Mordecai ruled from eternity. Although he may have been completely unaware of it, God had him in view. God had zeroed in on him. God had him cornered. Because if you look at the text, you see how God first used an interruption. In chapter 6, verse 1, it says, that night the king could not sleep. I love that statement. That night, while all of Susa slept, that night the king had insomnia. Of all the nights to not be able to sleep. What's so significant about that night? The king knew nothing of Haman's plan to kill Mordecai. Haman planned to seal that deal in the morning. But while Haman, Mordecai, Esther, and all of Persia slept, that night the king can't sleep. What kept the king awake? Maybe it was acid reflux. Maybe it was a bad hangover. Maybe it was his yearbook. Maybe he was worried. Maybe it was noise from the construction of the gallows. Maybe it was anticipation or curiosity about the dinner that Esther had prepared. We're not told what kept him awake, but on that night, the hidden hand of God slipped into the glove of history, and the king could not sleep. Now, many would just pass that night off as a random coincidence, but can I tell you, there's no such thing as random or coincidental when you're talking about God. God does everything on purpose, for purpose, and with purpose. That night was significant. It was the night after the first banquet Esther had prepared for the king and Haman, and it was the night before the second banquet. It was that night that Haman had the gallows built, and the night before he planned to hang Mordecai 75 feet in the air. This night wasn't just another night. That night the king could not sleep. God used an interruption followed by an inquisition. God woke him up so that he could catch him up. Because watch this, that night the king could not sleep, so he ordered the record book, the day-by-day journal of kingdom events, to be brought and read to him. God woke him up so that he could catch him up on his reading. He could have entertained himself in countless ways. He had a harem at his disposal. He had the best musicians in his employ, but he is directed to a specific book, and not just to any volume, but the volume that recorded a specific account that transpired 5 years earlier and involved a man named Mordecai. Come here, because they came across the story there about the time that Mordecai had exposed the plot of 2 royal eunuchs who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. As the king listened to how the plot unfolded, who discovered it and who reported it, he asked, what great honor was given to Mordecai for this? Nothing, replied the king's servants who were in attendance. The king was shocked. This man Mordecai saved my life. Had it not been for his discovery, I would have been dead. But when the plot was foiled, Mordecai received nothing, while Haman received a promotion. It seemed unjust and unfair at the time. However, had Mordecai been honored 5 years before, the events of that night would have never transpired. Mordecai had gone unrewarded, unnoticed, and unappreciated until that night. And I'm preaching to some Mordecais in this room right now who deserve a promotion, who merited a raise, who should have received that contract or that recognition for a job well done. But you didn't. It went to somebody else who had done nothing to deserve this. You ought to mark this down, Mordecai, that when nobody else notices, God does. Sometimes when you are asleep, God is awake working stuff out. When nobody else remembers, God does. God sees what no one else sees. prophecies, and God keeps excellent records. Hebrews 6:10 says it this way: God doesn't miss anything. God's delays are not God's denials. God is never in a hurry. God knows what God can do, and God knows what God will do. And that's why our foreparents in faith used to say, you can't hurry God. You just have to wait. You've got to trust in him and give him time. No matter how long it takes, he's a God you just can't hurry. But he'll be there, don't worry. He may not come when you want him, but he's always on time. So if you feel slighted, ignored, unappreciated, and unrecognized, God hasn't made a mistake. It's just not your time yet. But when that night comes, God will more than make it up to you for your good and for his glory. Xerxes was the man God cornered. But watch this. In the text, there's also the man God confuses. And I love this point in the story because here the script is flipped on Haman. God corners one man and doesn't allow him to sleep. But God confuses another man and doesn't allow him to succeed. Because watch this, it's in verse 4. Now Haman had just come to the outer court of the king's palace to talk to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows he had built for him. The sun is barely up, and Haman is rushing to the palace to secure the king's permission to finish off Mordecai. Suddenly, out of the inner court, Haman is invited in. Verse 6 says, when Haman entered, the king said, what would be appropriate for a man the king especially wants to honor? Haman thought to himself, he got to be talking about me. Because who else would he be wanting to honor? Impressed by his own resume, believing his own magic, intoxicated by his own cologne. Haman thought the king must be ready to throw the kingdom in his lap. So he came up with the most elaborate description of what should be given to somebody that the king wanted to honor. He said, give him a house, give him a boat, give him a car, throw him a party, put his name up in lights, give him a pocket full of money, and then let everybody know it. Then came the words he did not anticipate, because verse 10, Xerxes says, go and do it for Mordecai. For Haman, this was a demotion. Now don't miss this. At the very moment when he arrived to seek the king's approval to murder Mordecai, the king decided to memorialize Mordecai for saving his life. And he assigns Haman to deliver the honor. This is the ultimate in-your-face humiliation. Kind of like Nancy Pelosi's side clap. Y'all missed that. He was coming to the king's house to have Mordecai removed, but instead he leaves the king's house assigned to see that Mordecai was rewarded. Can I tell you the truth that I see in Haman's story? We need God far more than God needs us. All of us are valuable, but none of us are irreplaceable. If you don't believe me, go home, stick your finger in a glass of water and see what kind of dent you leave behind. You may make an impression for a moment, but as soon as you off the scene, things will go on. God's plan includes you, but it is never solely dependent on you, because God will always have somebody to do his will and perform his work. I am never under an illusion that I'm doing God favors by serving God. God is granting me favor by permitting me a part in his plan, a place in his kingdom, and a role in his mission. For Haman, it was demotion, but for Mordecai, it was promotion. Haman's demotion was opportune, while Mordecai's promotion was overdue. Verse 11 says, so Haman took the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him through the city square, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man whom the king especially wants to honor. No doubt those words tasted like gravel and sand in Haman's mouth. There was no one he hated more than Mordecai, and yet there was no one he ended up honoring more than Mordecai. Because what goes around, say it out loud, comes around. Things had gone around for Haman and finally come around for Mordecai. Psalm 75 verse 6 reminds us that promotion does not come from the east or the west, nor from the north or the south, but God is the judge who puts one down and sets up another. Encourage somebody near you. Just tell them, say, promotion comes from God. That means let people say what they want. Let them think what they want. Let them do what they want. When God decides to elevate you, nobody can stop. Mordecai received the overdue promotion from saving the king's life 5 years ago. He is rewarded with a specific apparel, animal, attendant, and announcement because God can turn things around. I think I've shared with you before the story of this only survivor of a shipwreck who washed up on a small uninhabited island. He prayed every day for somebody to come and rescue him until one day he decided to do something to try to help himself. He built a little hut out of driftwood for protection from the wind, rain, sun, and cold. But the next day a storm arose and lightning struck his hut and burned it down. Devastated, he cried out to God, why? He sobbed himself to sleep, but early the next day, he was awakened by the sound of a ship's horn. And looking up, he saw a ship coming and started jumping up and down, waving wildly. Excited to be rescued, he finally asked the captain, how did you know I was here? And the captain said, we saw your smoke signal. Y'all missed that. But God can take what looks like your devastation and turn it into your deliverance. God can turn things around. God can take the very thing you thought would ruin you and use it to revive you. You can't, but God can. Richard Spbc once wrote, nothing is so high that it's above God's providence. Nothing is so low that it's beneath God's providence. Nothing is so large that it's beyond it. Nothing is so confused that God can't order it. Nothing is so bad that God can't get good out of it. And nothing is so wisely plotted that God cannot frustrate it. What the enemy meant for your disgrace, God can turn it around by his grace. What the enemy wants to use to make you bitter, God can use to make you better. What the enemy wants to use to cause you to flounder, God can take that same thing and cause you to flourish. Yes, God can. I ought to have 2 or 3 witnesses in here that God will do what he said he would do. We see a man cornered. We see a man confused, but also note the man crowned. Haman had everything a man could have possibly wanted. He had fame, fortune, family, finance, and fidelity. He had power, possessions, prestige, privilege, and position. He was a man of affluence and influence. But all of that meant nothing to him because of the one thing he didn't have, the respect and admiration of a man named Mordecai. He went to the king to have Mordecai annihilated, but instead Mordecai ended up elevated. Haman wanted to be magnified, but ended up being mocked. He went from arrogance to abasement, from loftiness to lowliness, from delight to depression, from merriment to misery. Haman wanted Mordecai crucified, but instead Mordecai ended up crowned. And how does Mordecai respond? He responds in humility. Mordecai went back humble, while Haman went back horrified. After Haman bestows the honor of the king on him, what does Mordecai do? It's right there in verse 12. It says he went back to work at the king's gate. Now you missed that. Mordecai finally received a proper recognition and an overdue promotion. But instead of standing in front of the mirror and singing to himself, how great thou art, like Haman would have done, Mordecai returns to where he came from, to the king's gate. Mordecai seems to have said to himself, what God has for me, it is for me. So I'm going back to work. Let speculators wonder. Let haters hate. Let critics criticize. Let friends admire. I'm going back to work. And how should we handle promotion, popularity, and prosperity? Because the true test of a person's character is not how they respond to poverty, but how they behave in prosperity. My friend E. Dewey Smith once said that if you stay small enough long enough, God will see to it that you are big enough soon enough. I'm convinced the reason that many of us have not received the promotions we have deserved is because God knows we can't handle it if he give it. Because as soon as God blesses us to get $2 above dinner and get an extra suit in the closet, we get amnesia and can't remember where we came from or the people who helped us to get where we are. God knows that we'll gloat rather than give gratitude. But no matter what happens to you, never forget who you are. Never forget where you came from. Never forget the people who helped you along the way. Never forget the people who knew you when. Never forget the God that brought you thus far, regardless of how blessed you are. Never lose sight of where you were and what you were and who you were before God found you and saved you and delivered you by his grace. That's the humility that we see in Mordecai. But we see horror in Haman, because the last time Haman went home, he was bragging. But this time he went home broken. Life lessons were knocking on his door. But rather than welcome them, he began to blame others for his misfortune. And we know people like that, where it's always somebody else's fault. It's the fake media. It's presidential persecution. Because self-justification is the tool of those who want to make the rules and then decide which ones apply to them. Haman recounted what happened to his wife and hearing what transpired with ice water running through her veins. She said, "Baby, you good as dead." About that time, a knock came at the door, and before he could even get his thoughts together, his Uber had arrived to take him to Esther's banquet. At the banquet, Esther revealed Haman's plot to kill the Jews. The king was so upset that he got up from the banquet table and went outside to get some air. And while he was out there, Haman, realizing he was in deep trouble, got up and grabbed the queen by both her arms to beg for his life. And while he was holding on to the queen, Xerxes came back in and says, "Oh no, you didn't. I'm trying to figure out what to do with you, and you ain't here grabbing on my woman? Whose gallows is that?" They answered, "That's the gallows that Haman built to hang Mordecai." The king said, "Hang him on." And that's what old people used to say: if you dig one ditch, you better dig two, because the first one you dig, it may be for you. Hatred cannot win, no matter who they are, no matter what they do, no matter how things look. Hatred never wins, because the Lord can turn things around. I think my time is almost gone, but we just finished Super Bowl 53, and it was okay. I won't talk about it because I know some of y'all are hurting, but some of you remember Super Bowl 51. The Patriots were playing the Falcons, and in the third quarter, the Patriots were losing by 25 points. They were already celebrating in Atlanta because it was all but over. The fat lady could sing, the curtain could drop. There's no way you can recover from a 25-point deficit in the third quarter, because all things being equal, you just don't have enough time. But a couple of things happened in the game. The Patriots got better, and Atlanta made some mistakes. And slowly, New England, over a quarter and a half, climbed back until they tied the game and went into overtime. And when you go into overtime, you know there's got to be a coin toss to determine possession. And the Patriots won the coin toss. And when that happens, as I watched, I said, it's all over now. Now, the reason I said it is not because I'm a New England fan. I'm not. It's not because I love Tom Brady, because I don't necessarily care for him. But the reason I said it is I knew who he was as a quarterback. I knew that he had been there before. I knew that he had treaded on that ground previously. And I don't know, my friend, how long people have been hating on you. I don't know how long the enemy has been beating on you. I don't know how much the score has been stacked against you. You might be behind in the score and feeling like a loser in your life, a loser in your marriage, a loser in your finance, a loser in your home, a loser in your business. The score may be against against you. But can I tell you, I know a quarterback. I know somebody who knows how to call the play. I know somebody who knows how to handle the ball. I know somebody who knows how to work the field. I know somebody who knows how to score a touchdown because he's been there before. I know a quarterback who can turn losers into winners and defeat into victory. And if you just let him have your life, he can throw a touchdown with your experience. Give it to the Lord and let him score by his grace. Won't he do it? Stand with me. Take your neighbor by the hand.